In 1872, a British museum assistant named George Smith sat at his desk, translating a damaged clay tablet when his hands began to shake. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into the surface describe something impossible. A flood that covered the earth, a man warned by the gods, a boat built to preserve life, animals brought aboard in pairs, and a world that ended beneath the rising waters. Smith had just discovered the Epic of Gilgamesh, or rather, one fragment of it, and buried within its verses was a flood story written in cuneiform clay, carved by Sumerian scribes at least 1,000 years before the biblical account of Noah was ever set down. The tablet didn't just predate Genesis, it was older, more detailed, and disturbingly specific, as if it had been written by someone who remembered. What if the flood myths we've dismissed as allegory were actually fragments of a real catastrophe? What if humanity's oldest stories aren't myths at all, but warnings passed down from survivors? And what if the civilization that preserved those warnings, the Sumerians, inherited their knowledge from a world that drowned? Beneath the desert sands of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers once cradled the earliest known cities, clay tablets still whisper of a time before kingdoms, before written law, before history itself learned to speak. Each fragment carries the weight of something vast and vanished, a world that existed in the shadowed centuries before the waters rose. The Sumerians called it the time of the antediluvian kings, rulers who reigned for impossible spans before the great deluge swept everything away. History tells us that civilization began in Sumer, that writing, mathematics, astronomy, and organized society all emerged here around 3,500 BCE, blossoming suddenly in the Fertile Crescent like a flower with no seed. But the Sumerians themselves told a different story. They wrote that their knowledge was not invented, but restored. That kingship descended from heaven, that the gods taught them to build, to calculate, to map the stars, and that everything they knew, everything they recorded in their meticulous clay archives, was an act of remembrance for what came before. Before we drift deeper into these forgotten waters, if you're drawn to the kind of history that lives between archaeology and wonder, consider leaving a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from and what hour finds you here. I like to imagine these stories unfolding across continents and time zones, carried softly into sleep or contemplation, connecting us all to the same ancient mystery. The question that haunts every tablet, every cylinder seal, every foundation stone of those first cities is simple and unsettling. If the Sumerians were remembering, what exactly were they trying not to forget? Their tablets speak of cities that existed before the flood, kings who ruled for thousands of years, gods who walked among humans and taught them crafts that seem impossibly advanced for their time, star charts that match modern astronomical data, mathematical systems we still use today, medical knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered for millennia. And everywhere, woven through their chronicles and hymns and king lists, is the memory of water rising and a world ending. Tonight, we're going to follow those whispers. We'll trace the flood myths from Sumer to the far corners of the ancient world. We'll examine what archaeology has uncovered and what it still struggles to explain. We'll walk through the ruins of cities built with geometric precision by people who supposedly had no precedent. And we'll ask the questions that make historians uncomfortable, but that the evidence itself demands. Because sometimes the oldest stories aren't the most primitive. Sometimes they're the most honest. And sometimes, pressed into clay by hands 5,000 years dead, is a message that was never meant to fade. The waters rose once. The tablets remember. And what they remember might change everything we think we know about where we came from and what we've forgotten along the way. Around 4500 BCE, something happened in southern Mesopotamia that should not have been possible. A civilization emerged, not gradually, not through the slow accumulation of cultural progress we see elsewhere in the ancient world, but suddenly, explosively, as though someone had flipped a switch in the darkness. The Sumerians appeared with cities already planned, temples already towering, writing already systematic, and astronomy already precise. They had mathematics, sophisticated enough to calculate compound interest, legal codes comprehensive enough to govern complex societies, and architectural knowledge advanced enough to build structures that would stand for millennia. They possessed all of this, not at the end of a long developmental period, but at the beginning. This is not how civilizations are supposed to work. In Egypt, we can trace the progression. Pre-dynastic villages slowly clustering along the Nile, pottery styles evolving, burial practices growing more elaborate, until finally, around 3100 BCE, the kingdoms unified and the pyramids rose. There is a timeline, a sequence, a logical unfolding. In China, civilization emerges along the Yellow River through centuries of gradual development. Small agricultural communities, then towns, then cities, then dynasties. You can follow the thread backward, watch it thin and fray, but never break entirely. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec, then the Maya, then the Aztec, each building on what came before, each leaving archaeological evidence of their experiments, their failures, their slow refinement of technique and knowledge. But in Sumer, there is no such sequence. There is only arrival. The first Sumerian cities, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, appear in the archaeological record with their infrastructure already intact. Grid-planned streets, sophisticated irrigation systems, monumental architecture, centralized administration. The pottery is not crude. The tools are not primitive. The art is not experimental. Everything suggests a civilization that knew exactly what it was doing because it had done it before, or because someone had shown them how. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to the Ubaid culture, a people who occupied southern Mesopotamia before the Sumerians, beginning around 6500 BCE. The Ubaid left behind settlements, distinctive pottery with geometric patterns, and evidence of early irrigation. They were skilled, organized, and persistent, but they were not city builders. They were not astronomers. They did not write. And then, within a relatively brief span, the Ubaid culture fades, and the Sumerians emerge in the same region with capabilities the Ubaid never demonstrated. Same geography, different civilization. No conquest, no migration narrative, no clear transition. Just replacement, as though one world ended and another began in the same soil. The Sumerians themselves offered an explanation, though it is one that modern scholars struggle to accept. They did not claim to have invented their civilization. They claimed to have received it. Their origin stories speak of knowledge coming from the abzu, the primordial waters beneath the earth, carried by the god Enki. They speak of the me, those divine codes of civilization being transferred to humanity by beings who existed before the current age. They speak of Eridu, the first city, not as a human achievement, but as a gift, a blueprint manifested in brick and reed. And they recorded something else, something that sits uncomfortably in the narrative of human history, the Sumerian king list. This document, compiled from multiple sources and preserved across centuries, attempts to catalogue every ruler of Sumer from the beginning of kingship until the time of its writing. It divides history into two distinct periods, before the flood and after the flood. And the reigns it records for the antediluvian kings are not just long, they are impossible. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar, the second king, 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. 8 kings total, spanning a combined 241,200 years of rule before the flood swept everything away. To modern readers, these numbers are absurd, metaphorical at best, fabricated at worst, and yet the Sumerians recorded them with the same precision they used for astronomical observations and mathematical calculations. They did not treat these figures as myth. They embedded them in their chronology, placed them alongside kings whose reigns we can verify archaeologically, and referenced them in legal and administrative documents as historical fact. After the flood, the king. The list continues, but the reigns shorten dramatically. Kings now rule for hundreds of years instead of tens of thousands, and eventually the numbers descend into the plausible range of human lifespans. It is as though the flood marked a boundary, not just between two eras, but between two kinds of time. Some scholars suggest the antediluvian reigns are symbolic, representing dynasties rather than individuals, or measuring time in units other than solar years. Others propose that the numbers encode astronomical cycles, precessions, or mythological themes. But none of these explanations fully account for why the Sumerians would record such figures as straightforward chronology, why they would integrate them into their historical framework without marking them as allegory. Unless, to the Sumerians, these were not allegories. They were records of a world that operated under different rules, a time when kingship was longer, knowledge was deeper, and the boundaries between gods and humans were more permeable. The first city on the king list is Eridu, and archaeology confirms that Eridu was indeed among the earliest Sumerian settlements, perhaps the very first. Excavations reveal that the site was occupied continuously for thousands of years, with layer upon layer of construction, each temple built directly atop the ruins of the one before, maintaining the same sacred geography across millennia. The earliest temple at Eridu, dated to around 5000 BCE, is small, humble, almost primitive. But even this structure shows planning, orientation toward celestial points, and architectural features that suggest ritual knowledge. And with each successive layer, the temples grow larger, more complex, more precisely aligned, as though the builders were refining a design they already understood, not experimenting with something new. The Sumerians believed Eridu was the place where kingship first descended from heaven, the place where Enki established his temple in the Abzu, the place where order first emerged from chaos. To them, Eridu was not just the oldest city, it was the template, the first manifestation of the divine plan that would be replicated across all of Sumer. And beneath Eridu, beneath the earliest Sumerian layers, excavators found something else, Ubaid settlements, older still, stretching back into the murky prehistory of the region. The Ubaid built at Eridu too, in the same sacred location, suggesting that the site's significance predated even the Sumerians. But here is the enigma. The Ubaid culture shows none of the characteristics that define Sumerian civilization. No writing, no advanced mathematics, no monumental architecture, no centralized administration. They were agriculturalists, skilled craftsmen, but not urbanites. And yet within a few centuries of the Ubaid period ending, the Sumerians appear with all of those missing elements fully operational. How does a society leap from village life to city-states, from oral tradition to written law, from subsistence farming to algebraic equations, without leaving behind evidence of the transition? Mainstream archaeology offers theories, cultural diffusion, perhaps knowledge imported from neighbouring regions, a rapid innovation period driven by environmental pressures, a confluence of advances in agriculture, metallurgy, and social organisation that catalyse sudden complexity. But none of these explanations fully satisfy. There are no neighbouring regions at this time with comparable advancement to borrow from. The environmental pressures existed long before the Sumerian emergence, yet did not produce cities earlier. And the confluence theory requires us to believe that multiple independent breakthroughs, writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, legal systems, all happen simultaneously in the same place within a narrow time frame. What are the odds of that? Or perhaps the Sumerians were right in their own assessment. Perhaps they did not invent their civilization. Perhaps they inherited it, not necessarily from gods descending from the sky, though that is one interpretation, but possibly from an earlier culture, one that existed before the catastrophe the Sumerians called the abzu, the great flood that their tablets describe with such insistence. A culture advanced enough to leave behind knowledge, techniques, blueprints, encoded in forms that could survive disaster. And when the waters receded and the survivors emerged, they found these fragments and began the work of reconstruction. This would explain why Sumerian civilization appears complete rather than embryonic. It was not beginning, it was resuming. It would explain the Sumerian obsession with preservation, their compulsion to record everything in clay, to copy and recopy ancient texts, to maintain rituals whose original meanings had been forgotten. They were archivists of a lost world, desperate to ensure that what had been saved would not be lost again. It would explain their mythological insistence that knowledge came from before, from the abzu, from the gods, from the antediluvian kings who ruled in a time that now existed only in memory. And it would explain why, when we dig beneath Sumerian cities, we find traces of the Ubaid, but nothing that bridges the gap. Because the bridge was not in Mesopotamia. It was somewhere else, somewhere now drowned, and only its echoes reached the survivors who rebuilt on higher ground. The Sumerians themselves seem to understand that they were not the first. Their king list does not begin with human history. It begins with kingship descending from heaven. Their myths do not describe creation from nothing. They describe creation from chaos, from the mingling of fresh and salt waters, from the remnants of a cosmic conflict that preceded the ordered world. They were a civilization haunted by the sense of something lost. And perhaps what haunts them haunts us too, the nagging suspicion that history did not begin when we think it did. That civilization is older, stranger, and more fragile than we have allowed ourselves to believe. That the Sumerians were not the start of the story. They were the first chapter we can still read. In 1872, a young curator named George Smith was working in the British Museum, cataloguing fragments of clay tablets brought back from the ruins of Nineveh. Most were administrative records, temple inventories, nothing remarkable. But on November 22nd, Smith picked up a fragment that made his hands tremble. He began translating the wedge-shaped marks, and what he read stopped him cold. A great flood sent by the gods. A man warned to build a boat. Animals gathered in pairs, waters covering the earth. a bird sent out to search for dry land. Smith was reading a flood story, but it wasn't Noah's flood. It was older, much older. The tablet was part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, an Akkadian poem carved around 1800 BCE, over 1,000 years before the Hebrew Bible was written. Smith became so overwhelmed by what he was holding that, according to witnesses, he jumped up, rushed around the room, and began tearing off his clothes in excitement. He knew what this meant. The story of Noah, one of the foundational narratives of Western civilization, was not original. It was a copy. Or more precisely, it was one version of a story that had been told and retold for millennia, passed down through cultures, translated across languages, adapted and reshaped, but always preserving the same essential memory. The world drowned, and someone survived to tell about it. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of a king's quest for immortality. After the death of his friend Enkidu, Gilgamesh travels to the ends of the earth, seeking the secret of eternal life. He eventually finds Utnapishtim, the only mortal ever granted immortality by the gods. And when Gilgamesh asks how he achieved this, Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood. But Utnapishtim was not the original name. In the older Sumerian texts, predating the Akkadian version by centuries, the flood survivor is called Ziusudra, sometimes rendered as Atrahasis. These names appear in fragments dating back to 2100 BCE, and earlier in texts that speak of the flood not as myth, but as history, as something that happened, something that ended one world and began another. The story, pieced together from tablets found in Nippur, Ur, and Shurupak, goes like this. The gods grew weary of humanity. The noise of human cities disturbed their rest. The clamour of civilization, the industry, the expansion, it had become intolerable. Enlil, the chief god, decided to wipe humanity from the earth with a great flood. But Enki, the god of wisdom and water, had compassion. He could not directly disobey Enlil, so he found a loophole. He spoke to a wall. He whispered the warning to the reed fence surrounding Ziusudra's house, knowing the man inside would hear. Tear down your house, Enki said. Build a boat, abandon possessions and save life. The dimensions I will give you. Make the boat equal in length and width. Cover it over like the abzu, the primordial abyss beneath the world. Ziusudra obeyed, and here the text becomes startlingly specific. The boat was to be a perfect cube, 120 cubits on each side, roughly 180 feet. Not a long ship, but a massive, sealed cube, designed not to navigate, but to survive. It was to have 6 decks, 7 levels, divided into 9 compartments. The walls were to be reinforced with bitumen, pitch, oil, resins layered 6 times to make it watertight. The structure described is not a vessel meant for steering. It is a floating fortress, a sealed chamber built to endure chaos, not escape it. Ziusudra loaded the boat with animals, his family, craftsmen, and the seed of all living things. Then the storm came. The Sumerian text describes it with visceral terror. The storm raged. The tempest was awesome. The flood came forth. Its power overwhelmed the people like a battle. Brother could not see brother. People could not be recognized from heaven. Even the gods were frightened by the deluge. They fled and ascended to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs crouched against the outer wall. This is a remarkable image. The gods themselves, terrified, fleeing to the highest heavens, watching in horror as the world they had created dissolved beneath the waters. Even they had not anticipated the scale of destruction. For 6 days and 7 nights, the flood raged. Then silence. The waters stilled. Ziusudra opened a window and looked out over the drowned world. He wept. Everything was water, flat, endless, silent. All of humanity, all the cities, the temples, the fields, gone. He sent out a dove. It returned, finding no place to land. He sent out a swallow. It too returned. Finally, he sent out a raven. The raven did not come back. It had found carrion, something dead and exposed. Land was emerging. The boat came to rest on a mountain. Ziusudra made sacrifice. The gods, starving without human offerings, smelled the incense and gathered like flies around the altar. They realized their mistake. Without humanity, there were no temples, no hymns, no sacrifices. The gods needed mortals as much as mortals needed the gods. Enlil was furious that anyone had survived, but Enki defended Ziusudra. "He is wise," Enki said. "He understood the warning. Let him live." And so Ziusudra and his wife were granted immortality and taken to dwell in Dilmun, the paradise at the edge of the world, where they would live forever as witnesses to what had been lost. The parallels to the Noah story are undeniable. The divine warning, the ark, the animals, the birds sent out to search for land, the sacrifice, the covenant. But there are differences too, subtle variations that suggest not copying, but divergence from a common source. In the Sumerian version, the flood lasts 6 days. In the Bible, 40 days and 40 nights. The ark in Genesis is a rectangular ship, 300 cubits long. In the Sumerian account, it is a cube. The reason for the flood differs. In the Bible, it is punishment for human wickedness. In the Sumerian version, it is annoyance, the gods disturbed by noise, a more arbitrary, almost capricious motive. And most intriguingly, in the Sumerian texts, Ziusudra is not chosen for his righteousness. He is chosen because he is wise, because he listens, because he understands the language of signs. He hears what is spoken to wolves. He interprets what the gods will not say directly. Survival, in the Sumerian worldview, is not about morality. It's about awareness. Other versions exist. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic, written around 1800 BCE, expands the story, adding that the gods created humanity to do their labor, digging canals and building temples. But humans multiplied too quickly, grew too loud, and the gods sent plagues, droughts, and famines to reduce their numbers. When those failed, they sent the flood. The implication is clear. Humanity's survival was never guaranteed. We exist at the tolerance of forces greater than ourselves, and that tolerance is conditional. The Babylonian version, embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, softens the story slightly. Utnapishtim is rewarded not just with survival, but with eternal life, a gift that removes him from the mortal world entirely. He becomes a living relic, a memory in flesh, dwelling at the edge of existence where Gilgamesh must journey to find him. And when Gilgamesh asks for the secret to immortality, Utnapishtim gives him a plant from the ocean floor that restores youth. But on the journey home, a serpent steals it. Immortality slips through human fingers once again. The message, some knowledge, some gifts, are not meant to be kept. For centuries, these were just stories, ancient myths, poetic expressions of natural disasters, allegories about divine justice. But then the archaeologists started digging deeper, and they found something unsettling. Evidence, not of a global flood that covered the entire earth, but of catastrophic regional flooding in Mesopotamia that would have seemed global to anyone living there. Excavations at Shuruppak, Kish, and Uruk revealed layers of water-laid sediment, thick deposits of clay with no artifacts, no pottery, no signs of human habitation, sandwiched between layers of occupation. It was as though entire cities had been abandoned, buried under mud, and then, after some time, reoccupied by survivors. The archaeologist Leonard Woolley, working at in the 1920s, dug through 11 feet of pure alluvial clay. No tools, no remains, just silt. When he broke through, he found older artifacts beneath, signs of a civilization that had existed before the mud. Woolley famously declared he had found evidence of the biblical flood. Others were more cautious. The sediment layers were real, but they did not all date to the same period. Some were older, some younger, suggesting not one apocalyptic event, but multiple floods over centuries. Mesopotamia, after all, sits between two unpredictable rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. Seasonal flooding was common, catastrophic flooding, rare but not impossible. In 1998, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed the Black Sea deluge theory. They suggested that around 5,600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea breached a natural dam at the Bosporus Strait, flooding the Black Sea basin with unimaginable violence. The water would have poured in at 200 times the flow of Niagara Falls, raising sea levels by inches per day, submerging thousands of square miles of inhabited land. Coastal communities would have fled inland, carrying with them stories of the rising waters, the drowned world, the angry gods. If those refugees migrated south into Mesopotamia, their stories might have merged with local flood legends, creating the unified narrative preserved in Sumerian texts. The theory remains debated. Some geological surveys support it. Others find the evidence inconclusive. But it offers something tantalizing, a plausible mechanism for a real, lived catastrophe that could explain the persistence and specificity of flood stories across the Near East. And it's not just the Near East. Flood myths appear in nearly every ancient culture on Earth. The Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha, sole survivors of a deluge sent by Zeus. Hindu texts describe Manu, warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu, who builds a boat to survive the cosmic flood. Chinese legends speak of Gunyu taming the great floods. Native American tribes across both continents preserve flood stories. The Ojibwe, the Hopi, the Inca, each with their own survivor, their own ark, their own sacred mountain where the waters receded. In Australia, Aboriginal Dreamtime stories speak of a time when the seas rose and drowned the land. In Polynesia, Maori legends describe the god Tauhiri sending floods to punish humanity. The consistency is eerie. Different names, different gods, but the same structure. A warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel, animals saved, a bird released, a mountain, a new beginning. Mainstream scholarship explains this through environmental universality. Humans live near water. Rivers flood. Coastlines shift. Tsunamis strike. Every culture experiences water-based disasters, and so every culture creates myths to explain and remember them. Flood stories are convergent narratives, not evidence of a singular event. But there is another possibility, one the Sumerians themselves seem to believe, that the flood was real, that it was vast enough to be remembered across generations, catastrophic enough to fracture civilization, forcing survivors to scatter, carrying the story with them to distant lands where it would be retold, adapted, but never forgotten. The Sumerian king list, a document recording the reigns of kings from the beginning of civilization, is divided into two eras, those who ruled before the flood and those who ruled after. The antediluvian kings are said to have reigned for impossible lengths, tens of thousands of years. Then comes the line, the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven once more. The flood is not mythological window dressing. It is a historical marker, a boundary between ages. Everything before it is distant, legendary, hard to verify. Everything after it is recorded, measured, preserved. And what was lost beneath the waters? According to the Sumerians, almost everything. The tablets speak of great cities submerged, libraries drowned, temples erased. They describe knowledge that had to be recovered, relearned, pieced together from fragments. The me, the divine codes of civilization, were nearly lost. Enki preserved them in the abzu, the depths beneath the earth, and it was from there, from the waters, that they were retrieved and given back to humanity. The flood, in Sumerian memory, was not just a natural disaster. It was an epistemological catastrophe. It wiped out not only people, but the continuity of knowledge. What survived did so by chance, by the cleverness of a few, by the whispers of a god to a reed wall. Everything we know, everything we have built since, is reconstructed from what the flood did not take. Perhaps that is why the story endures, not because it is myth, but because it is memory. The memory of a world that drowned, and the fragile, desperate effort to make sure that what was saved, what was carried forward in boats and in mines, would not be forgotten. The Sumerians pressed it into clay. The Hebrews wrote it into scripture. The Greeks carved it into stone. Every culture that remembered the flood made sure the story would outlast the waters. Because to forget the flood would be to forget the most important truth civilization ever learned, that everything can be lost, that knowledge is not permanent, that survival is not guaranteed, and that the difference between extinction and continuity is often nothing more than one person listening when the gods or the earth or the rising waters whisper a warning to the walls. Among the thousands of clay tablets recovered from the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, one stands apart, not for its poetry or its prayers, but for its audacity. A document so strange, so defiant of conventional history, that scholars have spent more than a century trying to explain it away. It's called the Sumerian King List, and according to its opening lines, human civilization did not begin after the flood. It began before, long before. The tablet opens with a phrase that has become infamous in archaeological circles. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not invented, not established, descended. As though governance itself were a gift, dropped from somewhere else into the hands of waiting mortals. And then it lists the kings. 8 of them. Rulers of the antediluvian world, the age before the waters rose. Their names are recorded with precision. Alulim of Eridu, Alalgar of Eridu, Enmenluana of Bad Tibera, Enmengalana, Dumuzi the shepherd, Ensipziana, Enmendarana of Sipar, and finally Ubartutu of Sharupak, the father of Ziusudra, the flood hero. But it's not their names that disturb the timeline. It's the numbers beside them. According to the king list, Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, Alalgar for 36,000 years, Enmenluana for 43,200 years. The shortest reign listed is a mere 18,600 years. Together, the 8 antediluvian kings supposedly governed for a combined total of 241,200 years. And then, the tablet records with chilling simplicity, the flood swept over. Mainstream scholars dismiss these figures as mythological exaggeration, symbolic rather than literal, perhaps representing dynasties rather than individuals, or expressing the profound antiquity of these rulers through hyperbolic numbering. And yet the numbers are not random. They follow patterns. Many are multiples of 3,600, a number the Sumerians called a sar, a sacred unit that appears repeatedly in their mathematical and astronomical texts. Some researchers have noted that these reign lengths correspond to astronomical cycles, precessional ages, or sexagesimal calculations embedded in Sumerian cosmology. The numbers may not be literal years, but they are not arbitrary either. They encode something. Perhaps time measured differently. Perhaps generations compressed into single names. Perhaps something else entirely. But the king list does more than record impossible reigns. It records locations. 5 cities existed before the flood. 5 centers of civilization that rose and thrived in an age we are told should not exist. Eridu, the first city, sacred to Enki, god of wisdom and the deep waters, where the Abzu, the primordial ocean beneath the earth, was said to dwell. Bad Tibera, the city of metalworking, whose name means fortress of the smith, a place associated with Dumuzi and the goddess Inanna. Larak, a city about which little survives, mentioned only briefly, its temples dedicated to Pabilsag, god of war and healing. Sippar, city of the sun, god Utu, where the secrets of astronomy and timekeeping were supposedly preserved in sacred libraries. And Shuruppak, the final city before the deluge, home to Zeusudra, the man who would survive. These were not mythical places. Archaeologists have found them. Eridu, excavated in the 1940s by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, revealed a temple complex built in layers, each structure constructed directly atop the ruins of the one before, stretching back into periods so early they predate writing itself. At the lowest levels, they found offerings, fish bones arranged ritually, pottery shards, and architectural designs that suggest continuity of worship over thousands of years. The site was sacred long before the Sumerians gave it a name. Bad Tibera, identified with the modern site of Tel al-Medina, yielded evidence of early metallurgy, kilns, slag, copper tools. Sippar, modern Tel Abu Haba, contained cuneiform libraries describing its own ancient past, claiming its temple had been founded in an age before memory. Shuruppak, excavated at the site of Tel Farah, revealed something even more unsettling. A distinct flood layer, a thick stratum of water-laid sediment, separating 2 distinct phases of occupation. Below the layer, one civilization. Above it, another. The archaeology confirmed what the tablets had said. There was a flood, and there was something before it. But the king list is not the only document that speaks of the antediluvian world. Scattered across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian texts are references to a group of beings called the Apkallu. 7 sages, wise ones who existed before the flood and who brought the divine ordinances of civilization to humanity. They were not gods. They were something else, intermediaries, teachers. Beings who walked among mortals but were not quite mortal themselves. The Apkallu were said to be servants of Enki, emerging from the abzu to instruct humanity in the arts of civilization, writing, agriculture, architecture, law, medicine, astronomy. They were described in some texts as wearing the skin of fish, a detail so strange and so persistent that it demands explanation. Why fish? Why garments that resembled scales or aquatic forms? Some scholars suggest it was symbolic, representing their origin from the watery depths, the abzu, the source of all knowledge. Others see in the description something more literal, a type of clothing, perhaps, or a uniform, something that marked them as different, as other. The earliest and most famous of the Apkallu was Oannes. He appears in the writings of Berossus, a Babylonian priest who lived in the 3rd century BCE, and wrote a history of Mesopotamia in Greek. Berossus describes Oannes as a being who emerged from the sea near the shore of the Persian Gulf. His body, Berossus says, was that of a fish, but beneath the fish's head was another head, human, and beneath the fish's tail were human feet. He could speak, and he spent his days teaching the people of the coast. At night, he returned to the sea. Oannes taught humanity how to build cities, how to plant seeds, how to write and calculate, how to establish laws and temples. And when his work was done, he gave them texts, instructions preserved, so they would not forget. Then he departed. But he was not alone. 6 more sages followed him, 1 in each subsequent age, until the 7th appeared just before the flood. Their names are recorded: Wana, also called Adapa, Wanaduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, and Utuabzu, the last, who ascended into heaven as the waters began to rise. Mainstream historians treat the Apkallu as mythological archetypes, representatives of accumulated human knowledge personified as divine teachers. But the descriptions linger: fish garments, emergence from the sea, knowledge delivered fully formed, instructions preserved in texts. These are not the trappings of metaphor. They are the details of encounter, recorded by people who believed they were describing something real. And the Apkallu were not the only ones. Similar figures appear across the ancient world. The Egyptian Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, who ruled before the first pharaohs and taught the principles of civilization. The Vedic Saptarishi, the 7 sages who preserved knowledge through cosmic cycles of destruction and rebirth. The Greek tradition of culture heroes like Prometheus, who brought fire and knowledge to humanity against the will of the gods. The Chinese tales of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, god kings who taught agriculture, medicine, and writing in an age before recorded history. And in South America, Viracocha and the bearded teachers who came from across the sea to instruct the people in building, farming, and astronomy. The pattern repeats. Beings who are not quite gods, not quite human, arriving at the dawn of civilization, teaching essential knowledge, and then departing. Why does this narrative appear so consistently across cultures separated by oceans and millennia? Coincidence? Parallel myth-making? Or memory? The faint, distorted echo of something that actually happened, recorded independently by cultures who shared no contact, but who shared the same primordial experience. Perhaps the Apkallu were survivors of the antediluvian world, not gods, but humans or near humans, who possessed knowledge from the civilization that had been destroyed. Perhaps they emerged not from the sea, but from refuge, carrying with them the me, the sacred formulas, the star charts, the agricultural calendars, the architectural principles, everything needed to rebuild. And perhaps the fish garments were not symbolic at all. Perhaps they were diving suits, protective gear, something that allowed them to navigate the flooded world and retrieve what had been lost beneath the waves. We may never know, but what the tablets make clear is this. The Sumerians did not believe civilization began with them. They believed it had existed before, in an older world, under different kings, guided by beings whose knowledge surpassed their own, and that world ended. Not gradually, not through decline, but suddenly, catastrophically. The flood swept over, and when archaeologists began excavating the ancient Sumerian cities in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found evidence that supported the claim. At Leonard Woolley uncovered a flood layer more than 8 feet thick, a sterile band of water-deposited clay sandwiched between layers of occupation. Below it, pottery and artifacts from one period. Above it, a different style, a different culture, as though the population had been replaced. At Uruk, Lagash, Kish, and Shuruppak, similar layers were found, not everywhere, not uniform, but present. Evidence of localized catastrophic flooding events that match the general time frame suggested by Sumerian chronology. Some scholars argued these were ordinary river floods, seasonal inundations of the Tigris and Euphrates, events that would have seemed apocalyptic to those who experienced them, but not globally significant. Others noted that the layers were not all contemporaneous. The flood at did not align precisely with the flood at Kish. Perhaps there were multiple floods, or perhaps the survivors preserved a collective memory of flooding events that spanned centuries, but were later compressed into a single narrative, a symbolic deluge that represented the end of the old world and the beginning of the new. But there is something else in the archaeology, a gap, a break in the sequence of material culture that corresponds roughly to the period the king list places before the flood. In the deepest layers of Eridu, archaeologists found structures and pottery that predate the Ubaid period, the earliest recognized phase of Mesopotamian civilization. These artifacts are crude, yes, but they are there, and they suggest occupation far older than the conventional timeline allows. Beneath the first cities, there are older foundations. Beneath the first temples, there are earlier shrines. Beneath the first writing, there are older symbols, scratched into stone, pressed into clay, marks whose meanings have been lost. What fills the gap? Fringe theorists argue for advanced pre-flood civilizations, cultures possessing technology comparable to or exceeding our own, wiped out by cataclysm and forgotten. They point to the precision of Sumerian astronomy, the sophistication of their mathematics, the sudden appearance of writing and law as evidence of inheritance rather than invention. They suggest that the antediluvian kings were not mythological, but historical, leaders of a lost civilization whose achievements have been systematically erased from the record by time, water, and the refusal of mainstream archaeology to entertain the possibility. Mainstream scholars counter that the evidence does not support such claims. There are no remains of advanced machinery, no ruins of skyscrapers beneath the silt, no artifacts that cannot be explained within the framework of gradual human development. The knowledge the Sumerians possessed, while impressive, is not beyond the capacity of careful observation and intergenerational transmission. The flood layers indicate localized disasters, not global annihilation. And the king list, for all its precision, is not history. It is mythology, theology, a document meant to establish divine legitimacy for earthly rulers, not to record literal chronology. And yet the gap remains. The knowledge remains. The flood layers remain. And the question remains. If civilization began with the Sumerians, why do they insist it did not? Why do their oldest texts, their most sacred records, claim inheritance from an earlier age? Why do they name the cities that existed before? Why do they list the kings, the sages, the teachers who brought knowledge from a world that no longer exists? Perhaps because that world did exist. Not as fringe theorists imagine it, not as a mirror of our own modernity, but as something else. A civilization built on different principles, attuned to different knowledge. One that rose and fell in the long ages before writing, before recorded history, before the flood swept over and left only fragments, only memories, only clay tablets pressed with impossible numbers and desperate names. And at the center of it all stands Enki, god of wisdom, lord of the Abzu, the one who knew. According to the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods decided to send the flood because humanity had become too numerous, too loud, their noise disturbing the sleep of the divine. Enlil, god of wind and storm, chief of the pantheon, decreed annihilation. But Enki, ever the trickster, ever the preserver, opposed him. He could not openly defy the council of the gods. So he found another way. He went to Shurupak, to the reed hut of Ubatutu's son, Ziusudra, the wise king, the faithful one. And there, speaking through the walls so he would not break his oath, Enki warned him. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, save life. The flood is coming. He gave Ziusudra the dimensions, the materials, the instructions, how to seal the hull with bitumen, how to load the animals, how to survive. Ziusudra obeyed, and when the waters rose, when the storm of Enlil devoured the world, when the antediluvian cities sank beneath the waves and the kings of old were swept away, Ziusudra floated, alone, preserved, carrying within his boat not just animals, but seeds, tools, tablets, knowledge, the me that Enki had entrusted to him, the memory of what had been. And when the waters receded, when the boat came to rest on the mountain, when Ziusudra emerged into a world washed clean, he did not start from nothing. He started from memory, from fragments, from the knowledge Enki had saved. And he began again, rebuilding, teaching, passing down the formulas, the star charts, the sacred words, becoming himself one of the Apkallu, one of the sages, a bridge between the antediluvian world and the new age that rose from its ruins. The Sumerians never forgot this. Every king who came after claimed descent not just from gods, but from survivors. Every city built atop the flood layers carried within its foundations the stones of what had been before. Every scribe who pressed stylus to clay was participating in an act of preservation, an act of memory, ensuring that what the flood had tried to erase would not be lost again. And so the question that haunts every excavation, every translation, every attempt to reconstruct the antediluvian world is this. What did they know? What was lost? And how much of what we call progress is simply the slow, painful process of remembering what they carried with them out of the depths? Because the tablets insist. There was something before, and it was not primitive. It was not simple. It was older than we can imagine, wiser than we want to admit. And it drowned, leaving only this: names pressed in clay, numbers too large to believe, and the faint, stubborn memory of kings who ruled before the waters rose. But knowledge is not only preserved in stories. Sometimes it hides in formulas, in measurements, in technical precision that has no place in myth. Buried among the hymns to Inanna, the prayers to Enlil, and the epic tales of flood and creation, archaeologists found something unexpected. Documents with no mythic preamble, no invocation of gods, just pure, distilled knowledge. Metallurgical formulas specifying copper to tin ratios for bronze alloys. Architectural measurements using geometric proportions. Medical texts listing pharmaceutical compounds with dosage instructions. Agricultural schedules aligned to celestial events. And astronomical calculations of such precision that modern scientists had to double-check them with computer models before believing they were real. These were not the writings of a civilization learning through experimentation. They were the writings of a civilization remembering. One tablet, discovered in the ruins of Nippur, catalogued as CBS 11901, records the synodic cycle of Venus with perfect accuracy. 584 days. This is the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun, a measurement that requires multi-generational observation, sophisticated mathematics, and instruments capable of tracking planetary motion with remarkable consistency. The ancient Greeks would not accurately chart Venus for another 2 millennia. European astronomers wouldn't confirm the cycle until the Renaissance, armed with telescopes and centuries of accumulated data. Yet here it was, pressed into clay, precise and patient, as though the Sumerians had simply copied it from an older source. Other tablets record the orbits of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. They track lunar phases, solar eclipses, and the precession of the equinoxes, a wobble in Earth's axis that takes 25,920 years to complete a full cycle. To observe precession requires not just one lifetime of watching the stars, but generations upon generations of data, passed down and meticulously preserved. How could the first civilization already possess this knowledge unless they were not the first? And then there is the matter of Pluto. Or rather, something like it. Several Sumerian cylinder seals depict what appears to be the solar system, 11 distinct celestial bodies orbiting a central sun. 11, not the 7 visible to the naked eye: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, but 11. Modern astronomy recognizes 8 planets, plus additional dwarf planets and celestial bodies that wouldn't be discovered until the 19th and 20th centuries. Uranus in 1781, Neptune in 1846, Pluto in 1930. Could the Sumerians have somehow observed these distant worlds without telescopes? Some scholars dismiss the seals as symbolic, arguing that the spheres represent gods or stars, not planets. But the arrangement is too deliberate, the proportions too specific. The Sumerians kept separate categories in their astronomical texts. Stars were MUL, planets were UDU, IDIM, sheep of the sky, wanderers against the fixed background. They knew the difference, and they had names for bodies we can barely see today. Nibiru. A planet or celestial object mentioned repeatedly in astronomical texts. Some researchers have interpreted it as Jupiter, others as the North Star, a theoretical crossing point in the heavens. But a few translations suggest something else: a distant body with an elongated orbit, a wanderer that appears and disappears across centuries. The descriptions don't match anything currently recognized in our solar system. And yet the Sumerians tracked it, calculated its path, and recorded its influence on earthly events with the same precision they applied to Venus and Mars. Either they possessed observational technology we've never found evidence of, or they inherited star charts drawn by someone who did. Then there is the mathematics itself. The Sumerians didn't count the way we do. They used a base 60 system, sexagesimal, rather than the base 10 decimal system most civilizations developed naturally from counting on fingers. 60 is a strange choice. It's not intuitive. It's not tied to human anatomy, but it is extraordinarily efficient. 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60. 12 divisors. Compare that to 10, which has only 4. 1, 2, 5, and 10. The Sumerian system allows for fractional calculations, division, multiplication, and geometric measurement with far less complexity than decimal systems. And we still use it. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. The Sumerian mathematical framework never left us. It was too useful to abandon. But why did the Sumerians choose it? There is no evidence of gradual evolution toward base 60, no intermediate systems, no experimentation with other bases. It appears fully formed in the earliest tablets, already optimized, as though it were handed down complete. And within that system, they performed calculations that wouldn't be replicated for millennia. In the 1940s, archaeologists examining tablets from the Old Babylonian period, successors to the Sumerians, found a clay fragment now known as Plimpton 322. At first glance, it appeared to be a list of numbers, but upon closer analysis, mathematicians realized it contained Pythagorean triples, sets of three numbers that satisfy the equation A2 plus B2 C2. This was more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. The tablet wasn't teaching the concept, it was applying it, using it as a tool for solving complex geometric problems, calculating land measurements, and designing architectural angles. The knowledge was already embedded, already assumed, as though whoever carved those numbers had inherited a system so refined that they no longer needed to explain its origins. Another tablet describes the calculation of square roots using an iterative method nearly identical to modern algorithms. Others show an understanding of exponential growth, compound interest, and geometric progressions, concepts that wouldn't resurface in Western mathematics until the work of medieval Arab scholars and Renaissance Europeans. The Sumerians were not discovering these principles. They were using them, as though the formulas had been handed down complete, waiting only to be applied. And it wasn't just abstract knowledge. The physical artifacts tell the same strange story. In the ruins of Ur and Eridu, excavators found bronze tools, perfectly cast, alloyed with precise ratios of copper and tin, dated to periods that predate the so-called Bronze Age in the region. The transition from stone to bronze is supposed to represent centuries of incremental progress, slow refinement, trial and error. But the Sumerian bronze shows no such evolution. It appears suddenly, already optimized, as though the knowledge of metallurgy had been transplanted rather than developed. Cylinder seals from Uruk depict what appear to be mechanical devices. Wheels, gears, pulleys, objects that seem too advanced for their supposed technological context. Some seals show figures operating what look like looms or drills, machinery that implies an understanding of torque, leverage, and precision engineering. The Sumerians smelted gold, silver, copper, lead, and tin. They created alloys we wouldn't perfect again until the Industrial Revolution. They used granulation techniques in jewelry making that require temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius and precision that modern goldsmiths struggle to replicate without microscopes. And yet, there is no evidence of a learning curve. The earliest Sumerian metalwork is indistinguishable in quality from pieces made 1,000 years later. The knowledge didn't evolve, it simply was. And then there is the medical knowledge, inscribed on tablets that read less like ancient remedies and more like pharmaceutical manuals. The Sumerians kept detailed records of diseases, symptoms, and treatments. They understood the concept of diagnosis, the process of identifying an illness based on observable signs. They had separate terms for fever, inflammation, infection, and internal versus external ailments. They prescribed poultices, tinctures, salves, and oral medicines made from hundreds of identified plants, minerals, and animal products. One tablet, dating to around 2100 BCE, lists over 250 medicinal compounds, each with specific instructions for preparation and application. Willow bark for pain relief, the same plant that would eventually give us aspirin. thyme and myrrh for antiseptic properties, poppy extracts for sedation. These weren't folk remedies stumbled upon by accident. They were tested, recorded, and refined across generations, and some of the knowledge goes even deeper. Sumerian medical texts describe surgical procedures, setting broken bones, draining abscesses, stitching wounds. They had bronze surgical tools, scalpels, forceps, and needles found in burial sites alongside other professional implements. One text describes a procedure remarkably similar to trepanation, drilling a hole into the skull to relieve pressure, a surgery that requires not just courage, but anatomical knowledge and an understanding of sterile technique. They knew which herbs prevented infection, which ones induced sleep, which ones could stop bleeding or bring down fever. This was not shamanism. This was pharmacology. The Sumerians also revolutionized agriculture in ways that still shape the modern world. They didn't simply plant seeds and hope for rain. They engineered the land. They built irrigation canals, levees, and reservoirs, systems so sophisticated they transformed the floodplains of Mesopotamia into the most productive agricultural region on Earth. Their canals stretched for miles, distributing water with calculated precision. They understood gradient, the angle at which water flows most efficiently. They built control gates to regulate flow, preventing both drought and flood. They developed crop rotation, alternating barley and legumes to preserve soil fertility. They tracked planting seasons not by guesswork, but by astronomical observation, aligning agricultural cycles to lunar phases and the rising of specific stars. The result was surplus, enough food to support cities, enough stability to allow specialization. Scribes, priests, artisans, soldiers, scholars, all made possible because the Sumerians had turned agriculture into a science. But here is the mystery. This level of agricultural engineering requires not just observation, but mathematics, hydrology, astronomy, and long-term planning. It requires generations of accumulated knowledge. And yet, the Sumerians implemented these systems almost immediately upon settling the region. There is no archaeological evidence of trial and error, no failed canal systems, no abandoned irrigation projects, just success, as though they already knew what to do. So the question becomes unavoidable. Was this innovation or inheritance? Because the deeper you dig into Sumerian achievements, the more they resemble something recovered rather than invented. Every science, every technique, every formula feels like it was copied from an older source, fragments of a system that had once been whole. And the Sumerians were not alone in this. Across the world, in places that should have had no contact, other civilizations rose with the same inexplicable sophistication. Egypt appeared around the same time with its own advanced mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. The Great Pyramid, built around 2560 BCE, aligns to true north with an accuracy of 1/15th of a degree, incorporates the mathematical constant pi into its proportions, and uses construction techniques that modern engineers still debate. No evolution, no primitive forerunners, just sudden, staggering precision. The Indus Valley Civilization, flourishing around 2600 BCE in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, built cities with grid layouts, standardized brick sizes, advanced drainage systems, and urban planning that wouldn't be matched again until Roman times. They had weights and measures so precise that individual units found hundreds of miles apart are identical to within fractions of a gram. Who taught them? Where did the system come from? In the Andes, cultures that wouldn't develop written language built Saksai Huaman and other megalithic structures using stones weighing over 100 tons, fitted together so tightly that a sheet of paper can't slide between them. No mortar, no explanation, just engineering knowledge that appeared and then, in many cases, disappeared. The pattern repeats. Civilizations rising with knowledge they shouldn't have, building with precision that seems impossible, and then often collapsing back into obscurity, leaving only ruins and questions. Perhaps this is what the Sumerians understood. Perhaps this is why their word for knowledge, me, carried the weight of something sacred, something that must be preserved at all costs. Because they knew that knowledge was fragile, that civilizations fall, that floods come, and when the waters recede, only what has been written in stone or pressed into clay survives. The Sumerians did not see themselves as inventors. They saw themselves as custodians. The astronomical charts, the mathematical formulas, the medical texts, the metallurgical techniques, all of it was inheritance. A legacy passed down from the world before the flood. Their task was not to create, it was to remember, to copy the old tablets, to preserve the formulas, to pass the knowledge forward so that it would not be lost again. And perhaps that is why their science feels so strange to us. Not because it's primitive, but because it's too advanced. Not because it shows evolution, but because it shows restoration. The Sumerians were not climbing toward knowledge. They were clinging to it, holding fragments of something much older, something that had nearly been swept away. Civilization, they understood, was not built. It was restored. Science was not invented. It was recovered. And every formula pressed into clay, every star chart aligned to the heavens, every bronze tool cast in fire was not a triumph of human ingenuity, but a monument to survival. A way of saying, this is what we saved. This is what the flood did not take. The gods of Sumer were not distant abstractions. They were not formless, eternal, or transcendent in the way we might imagine divinity today. They ate, they drank, they quarreled, fell in love, grew jealous, made mistakes, and occasionally regretted their decisions. They bled when wounded. They required sleep. They travelled in vehicles, governed territories, held council meetings, and kept meticulous records of their domains. In every way that mattered, the Sumerian gods behaved like people, powerful people, long-lived people, people with access to extraordinary knowledge and technology, but people nonetheless. This is where the question becomes unavoidable. Were the Anunnaki, the great gods of the Sumerian pantheon, truly divine beings, supernatural entities beyond human comprehension? Or were they something else? Historical figures, perhaps. Leaders of an advanced civilization whose deeds became so legendary over generations that they transcended mortality in the telling. Survivors of the antediluvian world whose knowledge and capabilities seemed godlike to those who came after. Or, as some have dared to suggest, visitors from somewhere beyond Earth entirely. Beings who descended from the heavens, shared their wisdom, and then departed, leaving only stories and monuments behind. The tablets are frustratingly precise and maddeningly ambiguous at the same time. They describe the Anunnaki as coming from the heavens, from a place called the Duku, the sacred mound, or sometimes from Dilmun, a paradisiacal land across the water. They arrived before the cities were built, before humanity knew agriculture, before language was written down, and they brought with them the me, those sacred codes of civilization, the formulas and principles that would transform scattered tribes into urban societies capable of monumental architecture, astronomical observation, and legal governance. In the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest creation accounts, the gods are described as descending to earth when it was still barren, when cities did not yet exist, when all the lands were sea. They established 5 cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak, and appointed kings to rule them. These were not mythical kings. Their names appear on the Sumerian king list. Their reigns are documented, and yet they ruled before the flood, in a time when the tablets claim kingship had descended from heaven. The word Anunnaki itself is revealing. It translates roughly as those who came from heaven to earth, not those who were always in heaven, not those who created heaven, those who came from it, as though heaven were not a spiritual realm, but a place of origin, a location from which travel was possible. The cuneiform sign for heaven, An, is also the name of the supreme god, the father of the pantheon. But the same sign, depending on context, can mean sky, height, or above. It is a directional term as much as a theological one, and the Anunnaki, children of An, are repeatedly described as coming down, descending, arriving in radiance and flame. Cylinder seals depict them with wings, not delicate feathered wings like angels, but stylized geometric wings that some researchers have compared to the fins or stabilizers of flying craft. They are shown standing beside objects that defy easy interpretation: celestial diagrams, star maps, geometric forms that resemble nothing organic. In some depictions, they hover above the ground, surrounded by symbols of the sun, moon, and stars, as though their identity were inseparable from the cosmos itself. Mainstream scholars dismiss any literal reading of these depictions. The wings, they argue, are symbolic of divinity, markers of status, not functional appendages. The celestial symbols represent the gods' association with natural forces, not their origins. The stories of descent are poetic, metaphorical, mythological frameworks for understanding power, sovereignty, and the origins of civilization. And yet, the descriptions persist with a consistency that feels less like poetry and more like reportage. The gods arrived, they taught, they built, they departed. The same narrative structure repeats across cultures that had no known contact. The watchers of Hebrew tradition, who descended and taught forbidden knowledge. The Nagas of Hindu texts, who emerged from the waters with secret wisdom. The Viracocha of the Andes, who appeared after a great flood to civilize humanity. The feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerica, who came from across the sea, brought agriculture and astronomy, and promised to return. How could such consistency emerge independently? Perhaps it didn't. Perhaps the memory of the Anunnaki, or whoever they were, predated the flood. A memory carried by survivors who scattered to distant shores and rebuilt in isolation, each preserving fragments of the same original encounter. Or perhaps the Anunnaki were not extraterrestrial at all, but remnants of a pre-flood civilization, an advanced society that possessed sciences and technologies lost in the deluge. They emerged from the ruins to guide the survivors, and their knowledge seemed so impossibly advanced that it could only be understood as divine. We may never know. But the tablets record something undeniable. Civilization, to the Sumerians, was not invented, it was given. At the center of the divine pantheon stood 2 brothers whose relationship would determine the fate of humanity, Enki and Enlil. They were both sons of An, both members of the Anunnaki Council, both wielders of the Me. But their visions for humanity could not have been more different. Enki, whose name means Lord of the Earth, was the god of wisdom, water, creation, and magic. He dwelt in the abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, the source of all life and knowledge. He was humanity's creator, protector, and teacher. In the Sumerian accounts, it was Enki who fashioned the first humans, mixing clay from the abzu with the blood of a slain god, a divine essence that gave humanity consciousness, awareness, the capacity for thought. He did not create servants. He created beings capable of learning. And when the other gods grew frustrated with humanity's noise, their persistence, their proliferation across the earth, it was Enki who warned them. It was Enki who revealed the coming flood to Ziusudra and told him to build the ark. Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind or Lord of the Command, was the god of air, storms, authority, and divine decree. He ruled from Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, the axis mundi, where heaven and earth were thought to meet. Enlil was order, he was law, he was power enforced. Where Enki was patient and curious, Enlil was decisive and uncompromising. And according to the tablets, Enlil despised humanity, not because they were evil, but because they were loud, chaotic, disruptive. They multiplied too quickly. They spread too far. They disturbed the peace of the gods. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the most complete Mesopotamian flood narratives, Enlil cannot sleep because of the noise humanity makes. He convinces the council of the Anunnaki to send plagues, droughts, famines, anything to reduce the population. But each time Enki intervenes, teaching humanity how to survive, how to adapt, how to endure. Finally, Enlil grows impatient and proposes the ultimate solution: a flood. Not a punishment for sin, not a moral judgment, but an annihilation born of irritation. The tablets are unsettlingly blunt about this. Humanity crime was existence itself. But Enki defied the council. He could not warn humanity directly. That would violate divine law. So instead, he spoke to a wall. He stood outside the reed house of Atrahasis, later Ziusudra, and addressed the structure itself, knowing the man inside would hear. He gave instructions for the ark. He explained how to survive. And when the flood came, when the waters rose and the world drowned, humanity endured because one God chose mercy over obedience. This is not a story about sin and redemption. It is a story about conflict within the divine hierarchy, a disagreement about whether humanity had value, and the resolution, fragile and incomplete, was survival, not salvation. When the waters receded, Enlil was furious that humans had survived, but Enki defended his actions. Humanity, he argued, was necessary. They were needed to work the land, to maintain the temples, to preserve the knowledge. To destroy them entirely would be to abandon the purpose for which they were created. Enlil reluctantly agreed, but he imposed conditions. Humanity would be mortal. Their lifespans, once stretching for centuries, would be shortened. They would suffer disease, hardship, struggle. The age of direct communion with the gods would end. The Anunnaki would withdraw, not entirely, but enough. The gap between heaven and earth would widen, and humanity would be left to maintain civilization on their own. It is a strange myth, but buried within it is a question that refuses to disappear. What if this was not myth at all? What if the Anunnaki were a council, an assembly of leaders from a pre-flood civilization, or an outside culture, debating what to do about a growing population they had helped establish? What if the flood was real, a cataclysmic event that forced decisions about who would be saved, who would be warned, who would be sacrificed? What if Enki and Enlil were not gods, but factions, ideologies, perspectives within a hierarchy trying to navigate catastrophe? The ancient scribes who copied these stories century after century did not treat them as fiction. They treated them as history. Sacred history, yes. But history nonetheless. Events that had happened, decisions that had shaped the world. And they recorded them with the same care they used for king lists, tax records, and astronomical data. Then there is the creation myth itself. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian version that drew heavily from Sumerian sources, humanity is created explicitly to serve the gods, not to worship them, though that would come later, but to work, to till the fields, to maintain the temples, to perform the labor the gods no longer wish to do themselves. The text is shockingly utilitarian. The gods, it says, were burdened with toil. They dug canals, they carried baskets of earth, they grew weary, and so they created humans to take over the work. But the method of creation is what lingers. The god king, a rebellious deity, is slain. His blood is mixed with clay, and from that mixture, humanity is formed. Blood of the divine, earth of the mortal realm, a hybrid creation, part god, part clay, capable of thought but bound to flesh. The Sumerians return to this image again and again. Humanity fashioned from mud and divine essence, not born, not evolved, made deliberately with purpose. Is this metaphor a way of expressing humanity's dual nature, our capacity for reason and our vulnerability to death? Perhaps, but it is also precise. It is procedural. It reads less like poetry and more like documentation, as though the scribes were recording a process they believed had actually occurred. And then there is Inanna, the goddess of love, war, fertility, and the planet Venus. Her myths are among the most complex and layered in the Sumerian canon. In one tale, she descends into the underworld, the realm of her sister Ereshkigal. She passes through 7 gates, and at each gate she is forced to remove a piece of her divine regalia, her crown, her necklace, her robe, her power, until she arrives naked and powerless before the throne of death. Ereshkigal strikes her down, and Inanna is hung on a hook, a corpse, lifeless. But Enki intervenes. He creates 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, genderless, neither alive nor dead, and sends them into the underworld to retrieve her. They offer Ereshkigal sympathy, something no one in the underworld has ever received. Moved, she releases Inanna. But there is a price. Someone must take her place. Inanna returns to the surface and finds her consort, Dumuzi, sitting comfortably on her throne, unbothered by her death. Enraged, she condemns him to the underworld in her stead. On the surface, this is a myth about death and rebirth, the cycles of nature, the changing seasons. Dumuzi, god of shepherds and fertility, descends for half the year, and the earth grows barren. He returns, and life blooms again. Scholars have drawn parallels to the Greek myth of Persephone, the Egyptian story of Osiris, the dying and rising gods found throughout ancient cultures. But there are layers beneath the surface. Inanna's descent follows a precise ritual structure: 7 gates, 7 stages, 7 removals. It mirrors initiatory rites, mystery traditions, symbolic deaths undergone by priests and shamans to gain hidden knowledge. Was this myth a teaching tool, a guide for sacred rituals performed in Sumerian temples? Or was it encoding something older? A journey taken not symbolically, but literally. A passage through realms that once had physical reality. The underworld in Sumerian cosmology was not hell. It was Ker, the mountain, the deep, the place beneath. It was described geographically, with gates, rivers, and roads. The dead travelled there, not as punishment, but as inevitability. And the gods could go there, though it was dangerous. They could descend and return if the proper rituals were followed. It was a place, not a metaphor, a location within the structure of the cosmos. Modern fringe theories have seized upon this. Some claim the underworld represents hidden knowledge, occult sciences preserved by a secret priesthood. Others suggest it was a physical location, subterranean cities or chambers, where advanced technology was stored. Still, others propose it was metaphorical geography, coded instructions for accessing altered states of consciousness, shamanic journeys, or psychoactive rituals. The evidence does not support certainty in any direction, but the myths themselves resist easy categorization. They are too detailed, too procedural, too specific to be dismissed as pure fantasy. And yet they are too strange, too layered with symbolism to be read as literal history. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the Sumerians were doing something we have forgotten how to do, encoding multiple truths within a single story, history and metaphor, event and meaning, memory and ritual. The myths were not meant to be decoded in one direction. They were meant to be lived, performed, remembered, and interpreted across generations, each layer revealing itself to those ready to see it. And the parallels with other cultures remain unavoidable. The descent to the underworld appears in Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Hindu, and Mesoamerican traditions. The fashioning of humans from clay is found in Jewish, Greek, Chinese, and Native American creation stories. The divine conflict over humanity's fate echoes through Gnostic texts, Zoroastrian cosmology, and even early Christian theology. Either these are universal archetypes, patterns embedded in the human psyche that emerge independently, or they are fragments of a shared memory, pieces of an original event witnessed and recorded by the ancestors of all these cultures before they scattered across the earth. The Sumerians believed their myths were true, not symbolically true, true. They copied them with the same reverence they copied legal codes and astronomical tables. They built temples around them. They oriented their cities according to the geography described in divine tales. They structured their entire civilization around the belief that the gods had been here, had walked among them, had taught them, and had left instructions for how to continue. Perhaps they were mistaken. Perhaps they mythologized their own history, transforming human leaders into gods, natural disasters into divine wrath, technological advancements into gifts from heaven. Or perhaps they remembered something we have spent millennia trying to forget, that once, long ago, there were beings who knew more than we did, who came from somewhere else, or survived from an earlier age, who shaped humanity deliberately, taught us intentionally, and then withdrew, leaving us with one sacred task: to remember, to preserve, to carry forward what the flood almost destroyed. The myths are not the end point. They are the container. The vessel holding knowledge too vast, too complex, too dangerous to be written plainly. And within them, encoded in stories of gods and monsters, descents and ascensions, creations and floods, lies something older than Sumer itself. The question is not whether the myths are true. The question is what kind of truth they contain, and whether we are finally ready to decode it. The British Museum holds approximately 130,000 cuneiform tablets. The Louvre houses another 25,000. The University of Pennsylvania Museum contains roughly 40,000 more. Istanbul, Baghdad, Berlin, Chicago, Yale. Each institution guards vast collections of clay fragments, cylinder seals, inscribed bricks, and shattered prisms covered in wedge-shaped script. Estimates suggest There are between 500,000 and 1 million cuneiform documents scattered across museum storage rooms, university basements, and private collections worldwide. Of these, perhaps only 10 to 15% have been fully translated. The rest sit in drawers, wrapped in tissue paper, catalogued by number but not by content, waiting, silent, holding secrets we haven't yet learned to hear. It's not that scholars lack interest, it's that there aren't enough of them. Fewer than 100 people on Earth can fluently read Sumerian cuneiform. The language is difficult, context-dependent, layered with meanings that shift depending on the period, the city, and the scribe. A single tablet might take weeks to translate properly, and there are hundreds of thousands of them. At the current rate of translation, it would take centuries to read everything we've already found, centuries to catalogue, interpret, and understand what the Sumerians left behind. And that's assuming we find nothing else. But we keep finding more. In 2015, archaeologists working in southern Iraq uncovered a cache of tablets buried beneath a collapsed wall in what had been a scribal school. The texts were administrative records, mostly inventories of grain and livestock, receipts for temple offerings, nothing glamorous. But tucked among them was something else, a fragmentary hymn addressed to a goddess whose name didn't appear in any known pantheon. Not Inanna, not Ninhursag, not Nisaba. Someone older. The hymn described her as she who remembers the world before the breaking, and referenced rituals performed at a temple that, according to the text, had already been ancient when the hymn was written. The scribe noted that the temple's location had been lost, swallowed by the sea. The tablet was dated to approximately 2400 BCE, but the hymn it recorded was clearly much older. A copy of a copy of a copy, a memory preserved in clay, pointing backward towards something no longer accessible. How many other fragments like this remain unread, stacked in museum basements, waiting for someone with the skill and the time to decipher them? And it's not just the untranslated tablets. It's what modern technology is revealing about the ones we thought we understood. In recent years, researchers have begun using multispectral imaging and reflectance transformation imaging, RTI, to examine cuneiform tablets. These techniques use different wavelengths of light, ultraviolet, infrared, raking light from multiple angles to reveal details invisible to the naked eye. And what they're finding is astonishing. Tablets that appeared blank under normal light suddenly display faint inscriptions, text that was erased, overwritten, or so worn by time that it had become illegible. In some cases, the hidden text contradicts the visible text. Official records with unofficial notes scribbled in the margins. Royal proclamations with scribal commentary, questioning the king's version of events. It's like discovering that history has footnotes we didn't know existed. One tablet from the reign of Shulgi, a king of the Ur-3 dynasty, around 2100 BCE, was long considered a straightforward hymn of self-glorification. Shulgi praising his own wisdom, his military conquests, his divine favour. Standard royal propaganda. But when examined under RTI, faint script appeared between the lines. A second text, written in a different hand, possibly added decades or even centuries later. The hidden text described Shulgi's reign differently. It mentioned failures, famines, uprisings that the official record had omitted. It referenced the old cities beneath the sands, where the first kings ruled before the gods withdrew. Cities that by Shulgi's time were already myths. The scribes seemed to be correcting the record, adding context, preserving a memory the king had wanted erased. How many other corrections, other hidden layers, are waiting in tablets we've already catalogued and archived? And then there are the sites themselves. For over a century, archaeologists excavated Mesopotamian ruins using shovels, brushes, and educated guesses about where to dig. They uncovered temples, palaces, ziggurats, marketplaces, remarkable finds. But they were sampling, digging in spots that looked promising, following walls and staircases downward, leaving the rest buried. Now, technology is changing that. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and LiDAR, light detection and ranging, allow researchers to map what's underground without ever breaking the soil. And what these tools are revealing is staggering. Entire cities we didn't know existed. Structures hidden beneath centuries of sand and sediment. Evidence that the civilizations we've been studying were far larger, far older, and far more complex than we imagined. At ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2019 revealed a network of buildings extending nearly a mile beyond the excavated areas. Residential districts, workshops, storage facilities, an entire urban landscape buried and unmapped. The excavated portion of the ziggurat, the royal tombs, the temples, represents less than 5% of the ancient city. 95% remains underground. And is one of the most extensively excavated sites in Mesopotamia. If this is what we've missed at a site we've been digging for over a century, what lies beneath the places we've barely touched? Eridu is one of those places. The Sumerians considered it the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven after the flood. The site has been partially excavated, revealing a sequence of temples built one atop another, stretching back to around 5,400 BCE. 18 layers of construction, each temple built directly over the ruins of the previous one, as though the location itself was sacred beyond the buildings that occupied it. The earliest layers show mud brick platforms, simple altars, offerings of fish bones and grain. By the later layers, the temples had become monumental, decorated with coloured stone, bronze fittings, elaborate drains and basins for purification rituals. It was a site of continuous worship for over 3,000 years. But excavations stopped decades ago, halted by political instability, lack of funding, and the sheer danger of working in southern Iraq. The deepest layers, the oldest foundations, remain untouched, and ground-penetrating radar suggests there's more beneath the earliest known temple. Older structures, built with techniques that predate everything we associate with Sumerian architecture. Foundations laid in a time before writing, before bronze, before anything we'd recognize as civilization. What lies at the very bottom of Eridu? What came before the first temple? And what knowledge might be encoded in those oldest, deepest ruins? In 2021, researchers using remote sensing technology identified a massive anomaly near the site of ancient Lagash, a Sumerian city-state that flourished around 2500 BCE. The anomaly measured nearly 2 kilometers across, too large and too geometrically regular to be a natural formation. It appeared to be a canal system, or perhaps an artificial harbour, built on a scale that dwarfed anything previously found in the region. The structure was buried under meters of sediment, invisible from the surface, detectable only through variations in soil density and moisture content. Follow-up surveys revealed additional structures nearby. Walls, gates, what might be roadways or aqueducts, all part of a complex that extended far beyond the known boundaries of Lagash. The site hasn't been excavated yet. It might be years before anyone can safely dig there. But the scans suggest we've been drastically underestimating the scale of Sumerian engineering. These were not small villages. They were sprawling urban networks, infrastructure projects that required sophisticated planning, labor coordination, and technical knowledge we're only beginning to appreciate. And it's not just buried cities. Climate science is rewriting the environmental context of ancient Mesopotamia. For decades, scholars assumed that southern Iraq's landscape was relatively stable, that the marshes, rivers, and deserts we see today were roughly the same as they were 5,000 years ago. But paleoclimate data, sediment cores, pollen analysis, isotopic studies of ancient water sources tell a very different story. Around 3,200 BCE, the region experienced a dramatic shift. A period of increased rainfall, river flooding, and coastal inundation that lasted several centuries. This aligns almost exactly with the rise of Sumerian city-states. The environment wasn't stable. It was catastrophically unstable. Floods were constant. Coastlines shifted. Rivers changed course. Entire settlements would have been submerged, abandoned, rebuilt on higher ground. The Sumerian flood myths weren't exaggerating. They were describing lived reality. A world where water was both life and destruction, where the line between land and sea was constantly negotiated. And then, around 2,200 BCE, the climate shifted again. Abruptly. A mega drought, one of the most severe in recorded history, gripped the region for over 300 years. Rivers dwindled. Crops failed. Cities that had thrived for a millennium were abandoned within a generation. This collapse is well documented in the archaeological record. The Akkadian Empire fell. The Ur-III dynasty crumbled. Entire regions depopulated. But what climate data now shows is that this wasn't the first time. Sediment cores from the Persian Gulf reveal at least 3 earlier periods of catastrophic drought and flooding between 6,000 and 3,000 BCE. Each one severe enough to disrupt or destroy settled communities. Each one followed by a recovery period, a rebuilding, a resurgence of urban life. The Sumerians weren't the first civilization in this region. They were the first to survive long enough to write about it. The first to develop technologies, agriculture, irrigation, writing, law, that allowed them to endure what earlier cultures could not. But that means there were others before them. Societies that rose, built, perhaps even thrived, before being erased by environmental catastrophe. Societies that left no writing, no names, no myths, only traces in the soil, and perhaps memories, preserved in the stories the Sumerians told about the world before the flood. New dating techniques are pushing timelines deeper. Radiocarbon dating, once the gold standard, is being supplemented by optically stimulated luminescence, which dates the last time sediment was exposed to sunlight, and uranium-thorium dating, which can date calcium carbonate deposits with extraordinary precision. These methods are revealing that sites we thought were 5,000 years old might actually be 7,000 or 8,000 years old. That the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to settled agriculture happened earlier, faster, and more abruptly than previously believed. In 2018, archaeologists redated the earliest levels of Eridu using new techniques and found that occupation began not around 5,400 BCE, but closer to 6,000 BCE. And the mud brick platforms, the ones interpreted as simple altars, showed signs of astronomical alignment. They were oriented to solstices and equinoxes with a precision that required deliberate planning and observational knowledge. These weren't primitive structures. They were sophisticated instruments, built by people who understood the movements of the sky, people who, according to the traditional narrative, shouldn't have possessed that understanding yet. And there's more we haven't found. Southern Iraq and southeastern Iran are vast, largely unexplored regions. Decades of conflict, political instability, and restricted access have made large-scale archaeology nearly impossible. Satellite imagery, freely available through programs like Google Earth and ESA's Sentinel satellites, has allowed researchers to identify hundreds of potential archaeological sites, mound formations, geometric anomalies, soil discolorations that suggest buried structures. Many of these sites have never been visited by archaeologists, never surveyed, never excavated. They exist only as coordinates on a map, enigmatic shadows in satellite photos. Some are small, likely individual, buildings or farmsteads. Others are enormous, multi-kilometre complexes that could represent entire cities. Cities whose names we don't know, whose kings left no inscriptions, whose stories were never written down or were written in tablets still buried beneath the sand. What if the cities named in the Sumerian king list, the ones said to have existed before the flood, were real? What if Eridu, Badtibara, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak were not the only antediluvian settlements, but merely the ones whose names survived? What if there were dozens, hundreds of others, lost not because they were mythical, but because the flood and time erased every trace except the faint outline of their foundations, waiting beneath meters of silt for someone to find them? Modern technology is also revealing hidden information in tablets we've had for over a century. Machine learning algorithms trained on thousands of cuneiform signs are beginning to assist in translation, identifying patterns, suggesting readings for damaged or ambiguous text. These AI systems don't replace human scholars, but they accelerate the process, flagging tablets that contain unusual vocabulary, rare grammatical structures, or references to otherwise unknown places and people. In 2020, a machine learning program analyzing administrative text from the Ur-3 period identified a recurring phrase that had been mistranslated for decades. The phrase, previously read as workers of the temple, actually referred to those who remember the old cities. The texts weren't accounting records for temple labourers. They were lists of scribes and priests specifically tasked with preserving knowledge from earlier, lost settlements. Entire archives dedicated not to managing the present, but to remembering the past. How many other mistranslations are embedded in our understanding of Sumerian civilization? How many texts have we misread, misunderstood, or dismissed because we didn't have the context to recognize what they were describing? And then there are the chemical analyses. Researchers are now examining the clay itself, determining where tablets were made based on the mineral composition of the mud. Some tablets found in Uruk were made from clay sourced hundreds of kilometers away, near Eridu. Why would scribes import clay? Unless the clay itself was considered sacred, charged with significance because of where it came from. Other tablets show evidence of being fired at extremely high temperatures, far higher than necessary for preservation. Temperatures that would have required kilns or furnaces beyond what we believe the Sumerians possessed. Some scholars suggest these tablets were accidentally fired during building collapses or city destructions. But others wonder if the firing was intentional, a way of permanently sealing the information, making it indestructible. And if so, what information was considered so vital that it needed to be preserved in a form that could survive anything? The deeper we look, the more we realize how little we've actually uncovered. Every answered question reveals 10 more. Every translated tablet points to 10 others we haven't read. Every excavated temple sits atop older temples we haven't reached. The Sumerians are not a solved mystery. They are an ongoing revelation, unfolding slowly, piece by piece, as technology advances and access improves. Somewhere in a museum drawer, in London or Berlin or Baghdad, there is a tablet that will rewrite what we know. Somewhere beneath the sands of southern Iraq, there is a city that will force us to reconsider the entire timeline of civilization. Somewhere in the data we've already collected, in the scans and images and chemical analyses, there is a pattern we haven't recognized yet, a message waiting to be decoded. The Sumerians understood this. They knew that knowledge is fragile, that it can be lost, that preservation requires intention and effort. That's why they wrote everything down. Not just the grand myths and royal decrees, but the mundane details, the recipes and contracts and school exercises. Because they understood that memory is the only defense against oblivion. And perhaps they also understood something we're only beginning to grasp. That the story of humanity is not a straight line from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to enlightenment. It's a cycle. Knowledge is gained, lost, and recovered. Civilizations rise, fall, and are forgotten, leaving only fragments behind. And the task of those who come after is not to invent, but to remember, to sift through the ruins, to read the faint inscriptions, to piece together what was nearly erased. We are still doing that work, still translating, still excavating, still searching. And the Sumerians, silent in their clay, are still teaching us, still whispering across the millennia, if only we have the patience and the tools to listen. The flood did not erase everything. It couldn't. Because knowledge, once encoded, once pressed into clay and hidden in the earth, can wait. It can wait thousands of years if necessary, waiting for the moment when someone, somewhere, finally asks the right question and knows where to dig. And so we arrive at the edge of understanding, standing where the clay tablets end and the questions begin. We've travelled through the Sumerian memory of a drowned world. We have read their king lists that stretch back into impossible time. We have followed Ziusudra into his ark, traced the geometry of Eridu's temples, examined astronomical calculations that shouldn't exist, and listened to stories of beings called Anunnaki, who descended from heaven to teach humanity the arts of civilization. We have seen the evidence, fragmentary and strange, pressed into clay and buried for millennia, waiting to be remembered. What do we know for certain? We know the Sumerians existed. We know they built cities of remarkable sophistication beginning around 4500 BCE. We know they developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and architecture at a level that seems to have no precedent. We know their tablets describe a great flood and a world that came before it. We know they recorded kings who ruled for thousands of years in an age when gods walked among men. We know their knowledge appears suddenly, already refined, as though inherited rather than invented. These are facts, documented, undeniable. But the interpretation, that is where history dissolves into mystery. Were the Anunnaki literal visitors from the stars, advanced beings who seeded civilization and then departed? Were they survivors of a pre-flood culture so advanced that their technology seemed divine to those who came after? Were they anthropomorphized natural forces, poetic attempts to explain the incomprehensible? Or were they simply myths, stories told to make sense of a world that felt too vast and too strange to understand without gods? We may never know. The tablets do not answer these questions directly. They only insist, over and over, across thousands of years, that what came before the flood was real. That civilization was given, not invented. That humanity's role was to remember, to preserve, to carry forward the knowledge entrusted to us by those who came before. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the value of these stories lies not in proving where the Anunnaki came from, or whether the antediluvian kings truly lived for thousands of years. Perhaps the value lies in the question itself, in humanity's persistent, haunting need to search for its origins, to dig beneath the surface of recorded history and ask, what came before? What did we forget? What might we still recover? The Sumerians understood something we often overlook. That civilization is fragile. That knowledge can be lost. That floods, whether literal or metaphorical, can erase entire worlds. And that the greatest act of devotion is not creation, but preservation. To press knowledge into clay, to align temples to the stars, to record the names of the forgotten kings, to write down the stories before they vanish completely. That is what they left us. Not answers, but fragments. Not certainty, but invitation. An invitation to remember, to investigate, to question, to stand at the edge of history and peer into the darkness beyond, knowing we may never see clearly, but compelled to look anyway. So we leave you here, at the boundary between what we know and what we imagine, between history and mystery, between the documented ruins of ancient Sumer and the whispered stories of a forgotten world that may have existed before the waters rose. If this journey has sparked your curiosity, if you found yourself wondering what else lies buried beneath the sands of time, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell us where you're listening from. What mysteries call to you? What forgotten stories deserve to be remembered? And if you enjoyed this exploration, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who find themselves drawn to the shadowy places where archaeology meets myth. The search for our origins continues. The clay tablet still holds secrets. And somewhere, beneath the ruins of Eridu, beneath the silted riverbeds of ancient Mesopotamia, the voices of the antediluvian world are still whispering, waiting, hoping to be heard. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you back to the world before the flood.